Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please give your attention to the opening statement by Mrs. Anne Bremmer on behalf of the
Thank you.
defendant,
You're all
Timothy
standing for me.
Rankine.
That's a first. Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. I'm Anne Bremmer, and I, with Mark Conrad, I have the honor of representing Officer Timothy Rankine, who's, of course, seated with us at council table. On the night of March the 3rd of 2020, he was working graveyard for the Tacoma Police Department, and he was a relatively new officer. He'd only been on for a year and some months, and he was working with his partner, Messiah Ford, who's African American. He's not part of this case. His partner and he did about the same things in this case in dealing with Mr. Ellis. They drove through the frigid cold around 96 and Ainsworth. They had just had a call earlier where they assisted both the other officers in this case, Officer Collins and Officer Burbank. A typical night. In police work, there can be a lot of time of downtime, not necessarily boredom, but then seconds and minutes of sheer terror and having to react split-second decisions. They heard on the radio mic clicks, but nothing else. They stayed quiet so they could hear further because that's concerning. Officers communicate, of course, through radio, and they didn't have any other information. The actual radio itself, you're going to see the CAD report, but also the radio report itself, that shows you within a matter of just a few minutes their response. They knew then that there was some incident with Officer Collins and Officer Burbank. They were traveling a different way. They came on a U-turn and came back to 96 and Ainsworth, and this is what they saw. They saw that patrol car in the middle of the street, but not with emergency equipment on other than amber lights. That's concerning because they were in the middle of a busy street, and it was obvious something had happened. They saw before them Manny Ellis fighting with these officers. And you're going to hear actually from witnesses who saw him fighting. They actually saw it. The state's trying to tell you that Officer Rankine did everything wrong. But what they didn't tell you is everything that he did was right. When I talked to you in jury selection, talked about the Mark Twain quote, "Always do right, it'll gratify some and astonish the rest." He followed his training that night. He did his job. He did everything right. All lives are precious. Yours are precious. Mine's precious. Everybody in this courtroom, our lives are precious. Manny Ellis' life was precious too. But the evidence will show in this case that he had an enlarged heart due to many, many years of meth use and abuse. An enlarged heart. That meant it had to pump so much harder than the rest of ours. But he also had compromised lungs from years of meth use. Years. But that wasn't the only thing to consider in this case. And what the evidence will show, it's not what the prosecutors say. It's what the evidence will show. And what witnesses say from the witness stand under oath. And the evidence you hear in this case. The evidence is undisputed that he had an enlarged heart. The evidence is undisputed that he had compromised lungs. And the evidence is undisputed. He had a lethal amount of meth in his system that caused his death. That is undisputed. It comes from their own medical examiner for the Pierce County. And that level of meth would have killed anybody in this room, everybody in this room. That's undisputed. So on March the 3rd, that's what the officers encountered. One of the experts in this case is going to talk about an analogy of like a car that's old, that has problems. They can't go very far. And then you take that car and you put it, I don't know, 100 miles an hour, put it in a Grand Prix, run it and run it and run it until it can't run anymore. Because in this case, the medical examiner is going to tell you that he decided, and I'm going to read it exactly so that we have the, excuse me just for a minute with my notes. Now I can find my glasses. This is exactly what he said. And he has to write a report. He said that the extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor in this case. So why are we here? I want to talk about the medical examiner for a minute before I go back to what happened. In Pierce County, you have a medical examiner, and they are the chief pathologist for the county. That's Dr. Clark. He was there for a decade. And he certifies every death in this county, or did during his tenure. That would be accidental deaths, unexplained deaths, potential homicides, anything that would not be natural causes. This county and all officials rely on what he has to say in every single case, except this one. He certified the deaths and the causes of deaths of the 4 Lakewood officers that were killed. He certified the deaths and explained the deaths and conducted the autopsies of the children of Susan Cox Powell, Charlie and Braden, that were killed by their father here in Pierce County. And in this case, he's going to testify and tell you that he does not have a conclusion that this death was caused by these officers. It should be the case over. But the state, and it's dangerous when the state tells you facts, alternative facts is probably not the right word, but they're basically telling you to believe a version that's a half-truth, not true, and not supported by the evidence. There are 4 categories when a medical examiner, any pathologist, makes a determination about a cause of death, and this is very important. Homicide, that means basically the death had involvement with a person. Hom is man. Homicide. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that this is a homicide like we see in general parlance on television, things like that. It just means that there was some involvement with people in the case. The second is undetermined. The third is suicide. The fourth is accident. On March the 3rd, as Officer Rankine and his partner, Messiah Ford, got to the scene, they were basically trying to assess the situation, and what officers have to do is control first and then assess. So they got to the scene to try and help the other 2 officers who were losing a battle with Mr. Ellis. Now, this had happened twice before with Mr. Ellis, once in 2015 and once in 2019, almost identical circumstances. In 2015, he was involved in an incident at the A&W, an attempted robbery, and the people in the store or the establishment were actually throwing mugs at him. He was in a state of what's called excited delirium. That is something that's caused with drug abuse or drug use, exertion, excitement, and things of that nature. People can actually die of that alone. The symptoms: sweatiness, confusion, superhuman strength, and other things that you'll hear about in this case. So back in 2015, where this happened before, almost identically to what we have in this case, the police were involved and attempted to restrain him in a very serious case. And they were not able to control him or restrain him, even when he was handcuffed. Now, the officers are just doing their job, responding to a serious robbery, and they couldn't even restrain him in 2015. Why? Because of his meth intoxication, because of his excited delirium. Fast forward to 2019. Oh, and I should also say that a hobble was involved there. A hobble is basically like a restraint strap. 2019. he's involved again in a situation where he's high on meth and he is unable to be restrained. Now, he lived through those, but he didn't live through this one, and that's tragic. We ask you not to compound the tragedy of his death with the tragedy of holding these officers responsible for it, because they're not. And we're not saying he is either. He had an addiction. It took the better of him the third significant time he had contact with police officers. Meth was found on him in the first one in 2019, almost identical to this. And then we fast forward back to March 3rd of 2020. So Officer Rankine and Officer Ford get to the scene and try to assist. They run because they can see this is a major incident where other officers need their help. And in radio, that urgency is communicated not just by the mic clicks. They don't even know what's happening. They can hear yelling. They can hear a struggle. And Officer Rankine is thinking the worst of the worst, which it was. These officers, Burbank and Collins, were in a fight for their life with Manny Ellis. He was agitated. He was acting in a manner that was, the quote is, out of his mind. Out of his mind in fighting these officers. He actually had that kind of superhuman strength to where he could buck off. A couple of officers that you can see here, are pretty big. They were losing the fight when Officer Rankine and Officer Ford got there. So they wanted to help. They were asked for help from Collins and Burbank. And what the state's trying to say is that there was a spit hood that suffocated him in some way. There was a hog tie that caused positional asphyxia, that there was weight placed on Manny Ellis that caused his death. None of that is true. None of it. There was no hog tie. A hog tie is something completely different than what happened in this case. And I'll get to that in a minute. And Officer Rankine wasn't trained in it, and he didn't use it. Spit sock. Officer Rankine wasn't trained in it, and he didn't use it. Officer Rankine did not put all his weight on Manny Ellis. He used enough restraint with his partner to try and control Mr. Ellis so they could control and then assess the situation. We're going to show you a demonstration in this case. We're actually going to use Mr. Buck from my office, who's sitting back here, to basically have Officer Rankine get on his back, exactly as happened in this case. He was never up on his neck. He was never in any place that would constrict the breathing of Manny Ellis. He was simply trying to hold him down in his back area and his legs. You have 4 officers trying to do this without success. Now, there is a request for a hobble. A hog tie means basically that you've got the wrists and the feet connected. It's called a 4-point restraint in certain circumstances with a hobble. But a hog tie, an incendiary term from these prosecutors, is something different that didn't happen here. It didn't happen here. That the wrists and the feet are together and the person is on their stomach. That didn't happen. So the officers are trying to restrain Mr. Ellis. He's actually moving with the officers into the street, and it's a busy street. I don't know, we talked about in jury selection who's familiar with the area, but it's a major street, and there's traffic that night. He's moving them actually into the street with his body. And they're losing the fight. They're losing control. The only time that Officer Rankine was on Mr. Ellis was just to try and control him. He followed his training to the T. He'd only been on, as I said, for a short time. When he came to the Tacoma Police Department, he made $66,000 a year. And this was something that he had not seen before, something this violent and something where he needed it to assist in an urgent emergent, and very serious way. The time of this, the prosecutor said, I think he said 6 minutes. And he's trying to imply to you, they all are, that the I can't breathe was said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. What they're trying to do is to compare this in the public consciousness and to the jury's consciousness to a very different case, very far away, by repeating that to you over and over and over again, to appeal to your emotions, to say that this case is like that one, and it isn't in any way, shape, or form. Officer Rankine did hear that once, but Manny Ellis was breathing. Officer Rankine checked his pulse. It was at 80. Officer Rankine saw that he was breathing throughout the incident, but he's not the only one. The responding emergency personnel found that he was breathing and he had a pulse for well after the struggle. There were no guns used. There were no batons used. There was no kind of force by Officer Rankine. Remember, he came in at the end, near the end of this, and he was just seeing what he saw. He could only deal with what he knew. He didn't know about the meth overdose, intoxication. He didn't know about the excited delirium. He didn't know what had happened before this. He came in, saw what he saw, and assisted. And everything he did was reasonable. There were no injuries on Mr. Ellis's back from Officer Ellis. You'll see in the photographs. None. No injuries to his neck, no injuries anywhere that would cause any kind of restriction of his breathing. Nor was there a hog tie that would have caused positional asphyxia. One thing you see with positional asphyxia, if you were to Google it, is often with babies in the kind of slings. When they, in their position, their breathing is cut off if they're held in a certain way. Think about that when you think about what they're claiming. They're claiming the way that Officer Rankine and the others had Mr. Ellis in his position caused his death. And that's just not true. What did he do right also? He put Mr. Ellis in the recovery position twice after they were simply trying to hold him down. What is that? It's putting someone on their side. And you can hear in some of the audio the officers, Ford and Rankine and others, talking to Mr. Ellis, telling him to calm down, making sure he's okay, making sure he can breathe. And he could. Once he was in the recovery position the first time, he continued to be agitated, to resist. You'll also learn that when police officers encounter a situation where somebody forcibly resists or flees in an arrest or detention, officers can use all means necessary to overcome resistance and take someone into custody. There's a ladder of force. Verbal judo is the start. Sometimes there's swear words in that to control somebody. And then from that, hands, fists, feet. From that, perhaps a baton. You can go up to other levels of force. And of course, the highest is lethal, like a firearm. Every time an officer uses force, they're basically to meet and exceed that which they've encountered. That's kind of the overview of police use of force and what the law allows and requires. Officers have the right and the duty to use force to protect you, to enforce the peace and dignity of the city, and to enforce the law. The pulse at 80 was concerning to Officer Rankine because of the exertion that he had seen and the bizarre kind of out-of-his-mind behavior, because it remained consistent at 80. And he thought, well, that's odd. It shouldn't be at that consistent level. And he did hear at least once Mr. Ellis saying that he couldn't breathe. But he was breathing. He continued to breathe. And he was breathing thereafter for a substantial period of time. When the medics got there and fired, that took a while. They were coming to an area about at the end of their jurisdiction. And when they got there, Mr. Ellis was being controlled. And what Officer Rankine basically did was make sure that the suspect, Mr. Ellis, was under control before the medics attended to him or fire attended to him. That's his job. He can't let somebody who's out of control potentially harm responding personnel, medics, fire, or otherwise. He looks at his sergeant, who's now at the scene, and others are there too, for an okay to let him basically go with the medics. He doesn't refuse. He doesn't refuse to have anyone help Mr. Ellis. All he wanted to do was have him under control, make sure he's okay, and make sure that the situation is contained. That's the whole case. And that's why we're here. There's an agency that investigates cases like this, but they're not involved in this case. The prosecutors in this case that are seated here and seated here in the front row, and I think in the second row too, they investigated this case. That never happens. They work for the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. And they...
Object. This is
Sustained.
This case was charged in the midst, aftermath of a lot of social unrest. We talked about jury selection.
Your Honor, it's same.
Objection. Sustained.
Thank you, Your Honor. Lawyers aren't investigators. You'll see in the interviews in this case, they're conducted by all of these lawyers. And that they took basically what we call confirmation bias, which is they decided this case before...
Sounds argumentative.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will refrain from that.
Well, you may or may not be able to rephrase it satisfactory to me. I'm not sure you could.
Okay, then I'll move on to something else.
Good idea.
Thank you, Your Honor. The aftermath of this was a tragic death that happened because of the meth intoxication. When the medics attended to him and fire attended to him, everybody had his best interests at heart to make sure that he lived. But he didn't. And that in and of itself is very tragic. Who's Officer Rankine? Well, he grew up in Singapore. As a young child, was raised by a single mother. His mother and father are here, as is his wife, Kaylee, his sister, her husband. They believe in him. We all do. At about the age of 13, early adolescence, he was in this country because his mom married a gentleman named Alan Bremmer, who took Tim on as his own child. And on September 11th, Tim was in school, and there was a lot of commotion about something happening. Teachers, principals, they were all sent home early. And when he came home, his dad was crying in front of the television. He'd never seen his dad cry before, and he was watching what unfolded on September 11th with the planes going into buildings, with the just horrific day that day was. On that day, Tim decided, in a pretty young mind, that he wanted to be something. He wanted to do something. I think we all felt that way. He decided, fast forward a few years, to join the Army Rangers. And he served 2.5 tours. He started in Iraq, and then he went to Afghanistan. And during the course of his military career, he lost part of his thumb, that you'll see when he testifies, but he also suffered through tragedy, including his colleague, great friend, who was killed next to him in the course of an explosion.
Relevance?
In terms of his training, Your Honor, and background before he became an officer and why he became an officer.
Well, you've already kind of said why. As far as his training, the fact that someone died next to him has got nothing to do with that. Objection sustained.
After his time in the military, he settled here in Tacoma because, of course, Fort Lewis, JBLM, he'd been here. And after he had taken on a duty that he felt he should in the military, he decided to give back to his community and become a police officer in Tacoma. His training, what they train at Tacoma Police Department, some say it's about the same as what training a cosmetologist gets. But the training that he had, he followed to the T. And the state cannot tell you that he didn't. The state cannot tell you that he ever deviated from his training in terms of holding on to Mr. Ellis, in terms of the recovery position, and in terms of anything else that he did in this case. That's all he did. That's all he did in this case. He didn't put a spit sock on Mr. Ellis. A spit sock is about the same as the COVID mask that we all wore during the pandemic with respect to restricting breathing. There was no policy against using one, but Officer Rankine didn't use one. He didn't put one on Mr. Ellis. He didn't request one or anything else. At the time of this case, remember back March 3rd, 2020, the pandemic had started before that in our state, up in Kirkland, in the care home, the rest home, remember? The first outbreak was here. We were ground zero, January, February. So by March 3rd, officers were well aware that there was a risk with respect to any kind of contagion. So that's the time frame for using that particular spit sock or any. With respect to the hobble, he wasn't trained in that either, and he didn't use it. But he's here charged with criminal manslaughter. Didn't use a spit sock, didn't use a hobble, used minimal restraint. Never affected Mr. Ellis's breathing, but he's here charged with manslaughter. Let's turn to the medical. Like I said in the beginning, the medical examiner, Dr. Clark, he conducted the autopsy. He's the only one in this case, in the medical field, who actually examined Mr. Ellis and wrote a true report about what happened to Mr. Ellis. He's the only one. And he said that the methamphetamine was the cause of the death.
Objection, Your Honor, that's not the evidence.
I can read it again, Your Honor.
The jury will determine what the evidence ultimately is. This is counsel's remarks, and as I've already told the jury, counsel's remarks, statements, and arguments are not evidence, only the testimony of the witnesses and the exhibits admitted by the court are the evidence in the case. But anyway, you may proceed.
Thank you so much, Your Honor. He says, and I quote, "The extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor." Now, let's talk about what the state has done with that, because you'll hear in this case, he can't support their claim of criminal manslaughter. I'm going to repeat that. He can't support their claim, their charge of criminal manslaughter against Officer Rankine. He's the only one in this county, or was during his tenure, that can certify a death. He's the only one that conducted the autopsy. He's the only one that wrote the report that I just read to you from. But he'll testify. We anticipate the evidence will show that he could not say, beyond a reasonable doubt, or even 51%, that there was...
Your Honor, I object. This is part of the
Overruled. You may continue.
He cannot say that the officer's restraint or the Officer Rankine's control of Mr. Ellis caused the death. Think about that. The only expert that can really give you an opinion, their own medical examiner that they rely on day after day, month after month, year after year, in telling the public how people died, he doesn't say it's manslaughter. He doesn't say Officer Rankine caused this death. He can't. And if he can't, you can't. So the state went out because they didn't have an opinion that followed in their confirmation bias about what they thought in this case or what they wanted to say in this case. They went out and found experts. You hear often in cases that experts cancel each other out. You've probably seen that in TV shows. One side calls a bunch of experts. Oh, the other side, they call a bunch of experts. And they're usually pretty well paid.
Your Honor, this is getting going.
I'll permit this. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. In this case, those experts from the state, they had their opinions before they had the facts. They had the opinions before they had any facts, saying what the state wanted them to say. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's true. We had the medical records of Mr. Ellis. It showed his compromised heart, that showed his problems with his lungs, that showed that he also had schizophrenia, that he had struggled with meth, intoxication, addiction, and abuse for well over a decade. But they didn't. We had all the facts about what happened out there and what Dr. Clark said and what the medical evidence shows, what the pathological evidence shows. But their experts didn't. It's manufactured. Why?
Your Honor, our argument.
I'll stop.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor. But that's his case. And I ask you to consider that because the opening statement is basically a roadmap of what we're going to show in the case, what the evidence, in fact, will show, but also what the evidence won't show. And it won't show that Officer Rankine committed criminal manslaughter or that he did anything wrong for that matter. What about the witnesses? And what about the state's claims about certain facts in this case? I've already talked to you about their claim there was a hog tie. That's false. There wasn't. I've already talked to you about the fact that they say that a spit sock in some way was used and involved Officer Rankine. It didn't. And even if it did, it wouldn't have caused the death. What about a hobble? He wasn't involved. Let's talk about the other things they say and what they put out publicly for years now. Number one was that there were videos from citizens that showed that Officer Rankine acted inappropriately. That's not true. What you're going to see in this case, there's some very limited videos. One you'll hear from a woman that's yelling through the video, but who's not on it? Officer Rankine's not on it. Then you see kind of a doorbell type of a cam that doesn't really show much of anything. Now they're claiming that there's video evidence in this case that shows these officers committed crimes. And that is not true. Let's turn to witnesses. They don't talk about witnesses as much. Chad Hayes, a neighbor, saw this. And he saw, and they say, videos and witnesses show that Mr. Ellis wasn't fighting. That is not true. Witnesses and video show fighting in this case. And you're going to have to ask yourselves as a jury, why would these officers do anything extreme to Mr. Ellis? You know, why would they be involved in this kind of a confrontation if he wasn't fighting? If he wasn't suffering from excited delirium, meth intoxication, which can cause delusions, extra strength, resistance, being out of his mind. Why? That's their case. They're trying to say that Officer Rankine did something untoward in this case to kill this man. And it's just not true. The next thing with respect to witnesses and videos is that there's nothing else. So all these years they've been saying they have video and witness testimony to back up their case. That's false. Officer Rankine helped to secure the scene. He'd been asking the other officers, what do you need from us? He wanted to help, and they were senior to him. And so he did basically what he could do to help them. That's the level of his involvement. It never went beyond that. He never, in any of his actions, got up on Manny Ellis' neck, any way that could constrict his breathing, ever. Ever. And Officer Ford, his partner, Messiah Ford, was doing exactly the same things he was doing. There were no body cams back then. I guess the county council and city council, didn't approve the funding for that.
Your Honor, relevance.
I'm going to permit this.
Thank you, Your Honor. So there were no body cams. So none of these officers could show on a body cam what happened. And that's unfortunate, because it would show you that what they did was appropriate and lawful. Likewise, there were no dash cams. Again, it was funding, not the fault of Officer Rankine by any stretch of the imagination. But you don't have that in this case either.
Yeah, relevance and argument.
Overruled. Continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. So that we don't have that either. We don't have a dash cam or body cam or anything else. You'll hear, and we'll submit to you in the evidence, witnesses can be mistaken, they can lie, but evidence never lies. And the evidence in this case is very clear, that this was a meth overdose compounded by a bad heart that was enlarged, compromised lungs, and a situation that was extremely tragic for this young man to die, to his family, to his friends, and to his community, and to all of us when a young life is lost. But it was not caused by anything that Officer Rankine did. The state's experts, there's many of them that I've just talked to you about that didn't have the facts, but they had their opinions. Pretty hard to have an opinion if you don't have facts. They have said in varying ways that this was some kind of asphyxia or cease of breathing caused by restraint. I'm oversimplifying because this is an opening statement and you'll hear a lot more during the testimony. But if that was the case, there's one very crucial thing missing in what was found in the findings at autopsy. Petechial hemorrhaging. That's something that are like small dots of red like blood in somebody's eyes when they're not able to breathe. It's basically something that happens when you stop breathing, you're suffocated in some way, you're asphyxiated in some way, that causes hemorrhaging in your eyes. There wasn't anything like that with Mr. Ellis. So there's no evidence to support any of what their experts say. They had no facts, they didn't review any evidence, they came up with opinions. Those opinions are not supported by any evidence. No particular hemorrhaging at all. What wasn't said to you in terms of what in opening statement just now, and the court is absolutely right, opening statements aren't evidence, and counsel's right too. But what he said to you was,
Excuse me.
is what he didn't say to you, were all the things that Officer Rankine did that were absolutely appropriate, and they all were. Placed him in the recovery position twice, checked on how he was doing, checked his pulse, made sure that aid was there to help, made sure that it was safe, that he was controlled, and they could assess before medical came. And another thing he didn't mention, Officer Rankine performed CPR on Manuel Ellis himself, trying to save his life. He was breathing. He had a pulse. That's after intervention from emergency personnel. He got in and helped with CPR, and he'll testify, and he will testify in this case. He wants to testify in this case. He has to testify in this case to say exactly what he did that was right, and actually everything that he did that wasn't wrong. But after medical intervened to assist Mr. Ellis, Officer Rankine got in himself and performed CPR. That's what he did, and that's what this case is. Toxicology. It's kind of, we hear about that in cases and on television. It's basically what's in someone's system. And we've already talked about that there was a fatal, lethal dose of meth in Mr. Ellis' system. But it wasn't just that. There's something called toxicity with a drug. So it wasn't just that he had a fatal dose that killed him. It was that he was toxic because he hadn't used in a while. And so what happened, and what happens with toxicity is, if you have been using a certain drug, it could be cocaine, it could be methamphetamine, particular drugs, and you've had an addiction, and you've had constant use at a certain level, and then you stop, which is great. You heard from the state that he had gone for help and was clean for quite a while, a matter of months. But it didn't last, because we know from toxicology, that comes from the medical examiner's office, it goes to the tox lab. They analyzed and saw he had a fatal level in his system. But the toxicity part is the second part of this. And that is when you have used for whatever length of time and build up a tolerance for a drug. And you stop, as Mr. Ellis did. And then you start again after some period of time without building up that tolerance you used to have. And you start at the same dose you used to, it can kill you, and it killed him. It's toxicity. His body just wasn't ready for that. It had been back when he used on a regular basis, but it wasn't when he died, and that's a tragedy. How does anyone even know that? But we know that's what happened here. Anecdotally from witnesses that he had not used, that he was clean. And that is a tragedy, that he started again, became toxic, and he died. With methamphetamines, you're going to hear some statistics, and I'm not going to go through every detail other than to say, at the level that he had in the toxicology reports that are not disputed, he was basically at about twice the level it would take to kill somebody, even without toxicity. But then when you get to a level of somebody that is overdosed at that level, and the level you'll hear is 2.4 milligrams per liter is what was found in the toxicology report as part of the autopsy of Dr. Clark. He completes the autopsy, sends the materials to toxicology lab, and then they analyzed. Every case of a death that he examines, that's how it happens. So what they found, and it's undisputed, was a 2.4 milligrams per liter. 1 milligram per liter is considered toxic or lethal by most objective toxicological studies. And I'll just say that again. 1 milligram per liter is considered toxic or lethal by most objective toxicological studies or reports. His was 2.4, so over twice that level. Fatal. But when you combine that level, which is fatal, with drug use, enlarged heart, compromised lungs, the fatalities percentage are through the roof. That's what happened to him back on March 3rd of 2020, and it was tragic. He was 33 years old. He had that extremely high concentration of 24 milligrams, or of what I've just mentioned to you, the double the amount that would kill. He had a dilated heart. That is called cardiomyopathy. He had hypertension, and he had the pulmonary issues, that's the lung compromise. His family had told him for years it would kill him. the meth. And addiction, we've talked about it in jury selection. It's not always choice. And we're not denigrating him for this. We're not trying to put him in a bad light. We're just dealing with the facts. This is a fact. This is why we're here. That's why my client is charged with manslaughter, where he shouldn't be. These are the sad facts. Here's the radio traffic that I talked about earlier. 232153, Unit 317, mic click. 232159, Henry 317, go ahead. 232206, mic click, unintelligible. We're hearing Burbank and Collins with Manuel Ellis. They can't even say anything on the radio at that point. They're in a very life and death struggle. Radio says at 232211, Henry 317. And finally we hear some substance. 232213, 317, I'm at 96th and Ainsworth. 232218, priority traffic, Henry 317, unknown trouble, 96 and Ainsworth, 2322. 232223, beeper sounds. 232233, beeper sounds. 232238, from 317, these officers, unintelligible. So in real time with the radio, and you'll hear it in the courtroom, this is what we're hearing of what's happening with them. That Officer Rankine is hearing with his partner, Messiah Ford, in their car, trying to stay silent so they can assess what's happening. Somebody needs help. Something's very serious. 232243, beeper sounds. 232244, Henry 317, unreadable. That's evidence. That's what they heard. That's why they're quiet. That's why they rushed there to help. We're going to show you a spit hood, which is like a COVID mask. We're going to show you a hobble. A hobble and a force-point restraint. There was no policy against that, using that. And again, Officer Rankine didn't use it. Spit hood, there was no policy against that. And again, Officer Rankine didn't use it. In fact, none of these officers did. Multiple officers arrived at that scene within seconds and assisted. And other officers were involved with respect to those items I just mentioned. Officer Rankine did his job. He was trained. He did it with care. The civilian witnesses in terms of his involvement, Ellis was struggling. He was fighting. And Officer Rankine, per his training, just did his job. He didn't do anything wrong or criminal. The I can't breathe didn't happen 7 times. And Officer Rankine was just trying to calm Mr. Ellis down and have him quit fighting. That's all he wanted. And that's what he was not able to accomplish without some restraint, but it was minimal. Now, they're trying to say that he used full body weight. He didn't. He was simply trying to hold Mr. Ellis down. He didn't sit on his back. He didn't put all of his body weight on his back. We're going to have for you kind of a time frame animation to show you exactly what happened in this case, so you know what the evidence is, exactly what happened. And at no point will you ever see anything that would show that Officer Rankine did anything to restrict Mr. Ellis's breathing. I can't breathe is also associated with the cardiac event and what he was experiencing. But you know what? He could breathe. He did breathe throughout this whole incident and substantially after. And of course, he had a pulse. Police have a unique role. They're to enforce the law, but also protect. But they also wanted to protect him from himself. He didn't harm himself because he was hitting his head down on the pavement. And he was out of control. And it became clear, it's far more clear now, all these years later, I guess as armchair quarterbacks with 20/20 hindsight, it's clear now that he was extremely high, that he was very agitated, that he was acting in a manner that was violent and potentially self-destructive to himself. But they saw that too, that they had to make sure he's under control and then assess the situation. He, at the time, was on probation for an offense where he was not to use meth. He was not to use meth. He could go become incarcerated for that violation. And that's when he was confronted, or when the officers were there and confronted with him. You know, he fought with them, with his weakened heart and his physical limitations. He never really calmed down, despite all the exertion, and that was surprising too. He just didn't. That's what they saw. And Officer Rankine, he'd never really seen that before. That he just didn't, no matter what. And he didn't stop resisting or fighting. When you look at the level that he was resisting and also fighting with them, there were a number of officers who did try to restrain him, and they were not successful. There was no training that I can't breathe can be consistent with depleting someone's air reserve. Nothing. Keep in mind, as we sit here today, all of us in this courtroom, we know about another case. It's not this case. There was never any training that said, if someone says, I can't breathe, that would be consistent with depleting air reserve. There's a fair assumption that he's speaking, he's also breathing, but also, Officer Rankine saw him breathing, he conducted CPR, he was breathing, he had a pulse, well after the incident. Officer Rankine didn't know that Ellis had an enlarged heart, long-standing heart issues, that he had a lethal dose of methamphetamine on board that was exacerbated by that period of remission I told you about, that success that he had over meth. Officer Rankine didn't know he had that and that he was now toxic because he went to the same dose he'd been on long before and he had no tolerance and it killed him. Officer Rankine can only be judged by his actions on the information he had. He did what he should have done and could have done with the information that he had, and that's all we can ask of our police officers here in Tacoma or anywhere else. The autopsy, it didn't reveal an anatomic cause of death. What does that mean? There was nothing at autopsy that Dr. Clark found physically that killed Manny Ellis, aside from the toxicology results relating to asphyxiation or anything else the state is claiming. And he said the methamphetamine concentration, and I'm quoting, is well within the fatal range and could have caused his death independently. This case is charged on a recklessness theory. I'm not going to tell you what the jury instructions say or what the law is going to say, because that happens at the end of the case, and the judge will give you that at the end of the case. You, the jury, are the sole judges of the credibility of witnesses in this case, and you, the jury, are the final arbiters of the facts of this case. Only you. Nobody else. Not the media, not the public, not these prosecutors. Just you. The charge is recklessness. It's alleged that Officer Timothy Rankine acted with extreme recklessness, disregard of the risk, the substantial risk, that his actions alone would kill Manny Ellis. That's what he's charged with. There's no evidence of that. The most dangerous kind of prosecutors are the ones that put on partial facts, non-facts.
Your Honor, objection.
Sustained.
This is a case that shouldn't have been brought. You'll hear that. You're going to hear all the evidence in the testimony. And when you hear all of it, and we talked about this in jury selection too, they have the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt the highest standard in our country that Officer Rankine recklessly caused the death of Manny Ellis, that he disregarded a substantial risk that he would kill him. He didn't do anything disregarding a risk. He simply tried to control Mr. Ellis. That's all he did. He did nothing more. And it's up to you to decide whether or not to take into account what their claims are that are not supported by the evidence, or what the evidence itself shows. Common sense, you don't leave it at the courtroom. They don't have them anymore, the jury rooms. You don't leave it behind. You use your common sense as jurors to decide this case. And at the end of the evidence, we submit to you that the evidence will permit you, it'll lead you, and it'll ultimately compel you to find Officer Timothy Rankine not guilty. Thank you.